Good morning and welcome, everyone. I am watching our participation jump here as folks get logged in. We are going to do our best to start just after the 11:30 hour to make the most of our hour and a half together. So hang tight as we get all logged in here. Good morning and welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We're going to give folks one more minute to get logged in before we get started. Thanks so much. All right, we'll get started here. Good morning and welcome. I'm Nellie Catzen, the Executive Director of the Committee for a Better New Orleans. We are a civic engagement organization celebrating our 55th anniversary this year. Thanks so much for joining us for our Resident's Guide to the American Rescue Plan webinar. Over the last several months, we've been hearing a lot of conversation about our city's COVID recovery, and comments really range from confusion to excitement and hope, to cynicism, to fear and desperation. We're here to clear up confusion, help you get your questions answered, and truly we are delighted to have the true experts here to talk to you about it. As we all know, the budget is a moral document. It indicates it is the foundation to what we are able to do and not able to do as a city. Of course, this program, the COVID stimulus, the American Rescue Plan, is going to have a major impact on our budget now and for years to come. By understanding these programs better, community members and advocates are better equipped to participate, advocate, and hold our elected officials accountable. Committee for a Better New Orleans are your hosts. Since 1966, we've been bringing diverse community, business, and government leaders together to make New Orleans better. Our vision is a New Orleans that is equitable, sustainable, and thriving. We help people find and leverage their voice in local government and advocate for policies and practices that equitably engage New Orleans communities. This webinar is a part of our People's Budget Project, which we've been operating since 2014. Through it, we educate people about the budget, help them navigate and engage in the budget process, and advocate for more open, effective, and transparent budget processes. This year, of course, the American Rescue Plan is a huge component of that. Today, we're going to dive briefly into budget basics, just to cover the context that you need to really internalize this information. Then we'll dive into the state, federal, and the state and federal opportunities and restrictions before getting into the local opportunities, restrictions, and planning guidance, and hearing from the city on their perspective and process. Before a robust Q&A, we will conclude on time at 1 p.m. Please enter your questions as they come to you in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It should have 2 little chat bubbles overlapping on top of them. I'm delighted to hand it off to CBNO board member, advocacy committee chair, and the visionary behind CBNO's Big Easy budget game, Kelsey Foster, to walk us through a little bit about the budget.
Hey, everybody. I'm very excited to be here talking to you about city budget. My name is Kelsey Foster. I am a CBNO board member, and for many years, I was actually a CBNO staffer where I led our work on the city budget. It's really important to understand how public finance works. Public finance covers your bus and what time it arrives, whether there's a bus stop where you get on. It fills your potholes and it runs our city parks. It's really, really important to understand how public money works, but it's really complicated. So I'm going to give you the absolute quickest and dirtiest overview of the City of New Orleans budget right now. Bear with me because we're going to go kind of fast. This is a quick look at our budget for 2021. It's a little over $1 billion, which is right around where we've been for the past few years. For the purposes of today's talk and kind of a general overview of public finance, we split our money into what we call the general fund and the other fund. The general fund is our local revenue. The other fund is everything that comes from federal or state resources. So taking a look really quickly, you can see what some of those are. This general fund over here is about half property tax, sales tax, your permit fees, fines, even, things like your parking tickets that you love to get. This money is discretionary. That means the city can spend it more or less as they choose. That doesn't mean that we don't have expenses that are very demanding of this discretionary money, but it does mean that more or less the city can spend it as they need to cover expenses. The other fund, however, as you can see, is about half HUD, that's housing and urban development, that's federal money, as well as other funding from federal, state, and private sources. This money comes with restrictions. It's very, very restricted to usually very singular purposes. So if we get money from the federal government for infrastructure, let's say, and we are going to build maybe we're going to fix a street in Algiers. We can't move it and then fix streets in mid-city. It's very, very specific and restricted how most of this money will be spent. And that's going to be really important for today's talk because a lot of the money we're going to be talking about, obviously, is federal, and we will have some restrictions on how we can spend it. And you'll learn a lot more about that today. So that's where our money comes from. Where does our money go? This is a look at how we spend our general fund. So this is that discretionary local revenue. This is a budget that, a pie graph that you probably have seen a lot in the last year to 2 years as we've been talking a lot more about public budgets and what they mean and kind of the values that they hold. As you can see, public safety is a really big chunk of this pie. And there's a couple really important reasons why it's so big. First, and this is really important to understand, is consent decrees. We are under federal consent decrees from the federal government that mandate spending for our police force and our prison. These aren't optional expenses. They're very large expenses. That grows this piece of the pie. The second thing that keeps this blue piece so big is the Fireman's Pension Fund, which if you remember from the news a few years back, we are kind of filling some funding holes from previous years. That's also a major, major expense. So those are two really big ticket items that make this piece of the pie so big. The third thing that's really helpful to know when you're looking at this graph is what's not in here. There's a couple of things that don't actually fall within our city budget. Doesn't mean that we can't talk about them today, but it's helpful to know how to show up and where to talk about them. Things that aren't in this pie or in this budget are the RTA, so our public transportation, the sewage and water board, our parks, and I'm sorry, sewage and water board, our water and sewage utilities, and then also RTA, sewage, sorry, got me on my third one. Sewage and water board, RTA, and schools, sorry, public education does not fall in here. In most cities, those are three really big parts of what a government provides as services to its people. And so to not have that in this budget does kind of make it look a little bit different. So those are just a couple things that are really helpful to know as we're going in here. Lastly, I do want to just show you very quickly what our timeline looks like. We start kind of internally at City Hall, setting priorities for the next year as early as June. For everybody on this call, your opportunities to engage usually start in October. If y'all remember, years ago, we used to do kind of in-person town halls in each city council district, talking about the plans for the budget. With COVID, obviously, those are telephone town halls. Now I would expect them to be on the phone again this year, just to keep us all safe and healthy. And then in usually about mid-October to late October, the mayor's office, who builds that budget book, so they're really kind of the ones putting the meat on the skeleton of that budget, they will turn that over to our city council, usually in mid to late October. City council will hold departmental hearings. So each city department will have a day to come before city council and talk about what they've done in the previous year and what they plan to do in the year ahead. This is a really good opportunity for you to learn more about an issue you care about. So if you want to show up and learn about your pothole, Department of Public Works will have a day in front of council where you can go, you can hear from the department heads, ask questions yourself, advocate for your community. Those budget hearings, again, likely will probably still be virtual as we're trying to figure out how we're all going to get through the rest of 2021. But these are your two major opportunities to engage. Finally, the budget will be voted on by City Council by December 1st. That is a mandate by our city charter. And then that budget takes effect on January 1st of the following year. A final plug from CBNO. If you're really interested in this kind of information, and maybe you're part of a community group, neighborhood group, issues-based group, and you want to learn more about how you can get involved in advocacy around the budget, please feel free to follow up with us after this. We would be happy to come and do a little bit more detailed presentation for your group. We really believe that this is important information for every New Orleanian to know and be engaged in. So we're here for you as a resource. And with that, thank you so much. I'll turn it over.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, for that thorough overview. Our next presenter is Jackson Voss with the Louisiana Budget Project. Jackson is the Economic Opportunity Policy Analyst for LBP, covering issues like workforce development, minimum wage, payday lending, and other issues of economic justice. He's built his career in public policy in Louisiana and beyond, and is the author of 2 of LBP's recent briefs about the American Rescue Plan. We're thrilled to have Jackson here to cover the American Rescue Plan at the state and federal levels. Jackson, take it away.
Sorry, I had to find my mute button there for a second. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jackson Voss. As Nellie said, I am at the Louisiana Budget Project, and I'm here today to talk about the American Rescue Plan, and in particular, how the state can spend these dollars. And I'll touch a little bit on local issues, but I know BGR is going to go into more detail on that. So just to start off with, the American Rescue Plan Act was passed earlier this year, as many of you know. It was a $1.88 trillion package that was intended to deliver critically needed federal stimulus and dollars to help states and local governments as a part of that close budget holes and cases and respond directly to the public health and economic crisis that was caused by COVID. So $350 billion of that $1.88 trillion was intended to do that. And of that $350 billion, Louisiana has received a portion of $4.82 billion, both to the state and to local governments. So, and these are things that can, again, be used to close budget holes and spur economic recovery as we hopefully get COVID back under control and start reopening the economy. So these state and local funds, what these are intended to do, there are four set purposes that the Department of Treasury has kind of helped to clarify. And those include supporting public health efforts to end the spread of COVID and distribute vaccinations, replacing lost tax revenue for state and local governments that in order to fund essential public services that might have been reduced during the pandemic, providing economic relief and stability to households and businesses and nonprofits, and then addressing inequities. And there's been a real focus on this from Treasury. They really would like for states, local governments to really focus in on addressing the unequal impacts, public health and economic impacts of COVID and the pandemic that oftentimes pre-existed the pandemic, but were made much worse. And that can also include some infrastructure, as I'll go into more detail about, but specifically water, sewage, and broadband infrastructure. So these funds were allocated using a formula that takes into account state and local poverty rates, unemployment rates, population density, a few other categories that they use to calculate usually emergency and disaster related relief. These funds are coming in two tranches. The first arrived this past May. The second will come May of next year. And these funds have to be kind of allocated for certain purposes between 2021 and 2024, and then spent by 2026. And I think anything that's unspent will be returned to the Department of Treasury. So, and just to kind of put things into perspective, one thing I've been trying to help people see, because these are large pots of money, but it is important to keep it, I think, in perspective. And Kelsey's charts are useful too. So she showed kind of like the size of the municipal budget for New Orleans. And as you can see, there's this large pot. I didn't have room to put the scale 1.88 trillion, but the 350 billion, the state gets about 2/3 of that. Local governments get the other third of that from the four. And then the state of Louisiana and local governments of Louisiana, kind of a similar split. And then New Orleans gets the largest allocation of all of our metropolitan cities of 387 million, which is about a little bit more than a third of your annual budget. And if you can kind of see, though, it's important to keep in mind, this is a lot of money at one time, but it is not necessarily, it's a lot of money, but it's not that much money if you look at the size of my circles that are not quite to scale. So what can this money be spent on? So I kind of went through this a little bit before, but I want to read kind of directly from the Treasury guidance what these things mean. So first, to respond to public health emergency and its negative economic impacts. So this can be assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, or to impacted industries like tourism, travel, and hospitality. To respond to workers performing essential work during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this can include premium pay to current eligible workers. It can also include back pay. I can go into more detail about that later in their Q&A, but we can significantly boost workers' pay during the pandemic for frontline workers. It's also to help provide provision of government services to the extent that they had to be reduced in revenue because of the public health emergency. This is especially relevant for services like housing, public transportation, anything else that might have been either furloughed or kind of reduced because of expected drops in sales tax revenue, especially. And then to make necessary investments in water, sewage, and broadband infrastructure. And that can include drainage as well. That's a stormwater drainage, and that's important for us, obviously, and especially for New Orleans. What can't these funds be used on? And just to clarify, the two things that are really spelled out very clearly in the law, and that Treasury has really emphasized as well, is that we can't use these funds to shore up pension funds. So state and local government can't put this into their state or local pension funds. And you can't use it to offset reductions in tax revenues that are a result of cutting taxes, right? So the state of Louisiana cannot use rescue plan dollars to make up for any lost revenue from tax cuts. They can't fund like the Department of Education if it was impacted in some way by a tax cut that was adopted sometime between 2021 and 2024. So it's just an important detail, I think. But then the question about infrastructure, I think, is one that comes up a lot. And it's one that I get asked a lot. In my understanding, in all the research I've been able to do and all the conversations I've been able to have, both with people in local government and state and federal government, is that general infrastructure projects like road repairs, building a bridge, these are not going to be considered eligible uses by the Department of Treasury. And in fact, they have much more detailed outlines in any of their project proposals and their reporting requirements. But basically, any infrastructure project, if it isn't in the category of water, sewage, or broadband, it needs to address a specific public health or economic need. So things like providing affordable housing could pass muster, but filling potholes, unless it's serving some sort of public health or equity need, is probably not going to pass muster. So I just want to also quickly mention, obviously yesterday we got big news, big important news, the extension of the eviction and moratorium through October 3rd. That gives the state and the city and the cities across the state more time to kind of distribute some of the essential funds that we've received from the federal government for rental assistance, especially. New Orleans and Louisiana also received a substantial amount of home supplemental funding, and that's funding to help kind of address housing insecurity and homelessness. And the city of New Orleans actually received a substantial chunk of money for public transit based on the urbanized area formula allocation. And so those are funds that can be used to help shore up the bus system and potentially also, I guess, the streetcar system. But yeah, so I just wanted to add that really quickly. And the last thing I want to emphasize, though, these are really funds that are first and foremost meant to respond to the needs of people, and we have no shortage of needs here in Louisiana. At the Louisiana Budget Project, we focus a great deal on how policy affects low-income and moderate-income families. It's also important to recognize that in addition to the hardship those folks faced before the pandemic and during the pandemic, the impacts of COVID were really not evenly distributed among the population, right? So I have up here like unemployment rate, access to internet, median income, poverty rate. All of these things, in addition to actually experiencing COVID, were not experienced evenly by the people of New Orleans, right? It was the poorest people in our communities. It was the Black community in particular that faced the most hardship over the last year and before this past year. And so local government and public officials, I think, need to be keenly aware of how these funds can be utilized to kind of address these racial and economic inequities, especially in cities like New Orleans, where those impacts were really not equitably distributed. So I'm looking forward to our question section, but I think that's all I really have here. Yeah. Here's some reading that you can do. We published several things on ARPA, and I'll pass it back to Nellie now.
Thank you so much, Jackson. And please note, for those of you who are looking to click on those links, they will be emailed out along with the presentations after the webinar is finished. So don't stress about writing it down verbatim here. Our next presenter is Susie Dudis from the Bureau of Governmental Research. Susie is a research analyst for BGR and is the author of their recent report entitled Handle with Care: Public Planning and Accountability Must Guide Spending of Federal Relief Funds, which she'll be presenting to us today. She's been a member of the Analyst team at BGR since 2017 and brings her background in economics and international development to her research and analysis. We're delighted to have Susie here to present a deeper dive into New Orleans local allocations and in particular best practices in planning our local recovery. Thank you, Susie. Take it away.
Thank you, Nellie, and thanks to the Committee for a Better New Orleans for inviting us here today to present Handle with Care, one of our recent releases, and a big thanks also to our audience for taking this opportunity to engage on such an important issue. Just a little bit about BGR. We are a private, nonprofit, independent research organization dedicated to informed public policy making and the effective use of public resources for the improvement of government in the greater New Orleans metropolitan area. And our role in local public policy, we are nonpartisan, independent, and an objective resource. We elevate facts and research over politics. We identify public policy problems and offer solutions. We provide a foundation for informed engagement. And part of that informed engagement that we provide comes through the in-depth reports that many of you know us for on various public policy topics that you see here. We have a valuable citizen resource in an online library on our website, bgr.org. A searchable research library we have includes now over 200 reports on these various public policy issues, from schools and infrastructure and the justice system to public transit, property assessments, the Sewage and Water Board. And we look at these issues in 3 parishes here in Louisiana: New Orleans, Jefferson Parish, and St. Tammany. So on to the issue here today, the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA. As Jackson mentioned, we have unprecedented funding here, $1.8 billion for Louisiana parish and municipal governments, and that includes $388 million for New Orleans, the largest in Louisiana. And that $388 million is coming for New Orleans from both the municipal and parish government portions of the funding. New Orleans is somewhat unique in Louisiana, where the city is the parish and the parish is the city, which is different from Jefferson Parish, where you see is getting $84 million. But within Jefferson Parish, there are other municipalities that will receive their own independent ARPA allocation. For example, Kenner will receive $14 million. Metairie, on the other hand, is not actually an incorporated municipality, so it would not be getting within Jefferson Parish its own allocation. So the allocations for urban parishes and larger municipalities, the federal government based this on population as well as various measures of poverty, using these measures that it uses also for allocating its community development block grants. So it's sort of an established methodology that it used to do this. And what's really interesting here about the ARPA funding is that it has substantial flexibility for governments and how they can use it. And this really creates a rare opportunity to address local needs without burdening taxpayers. So on to the local uses, eligible uses for ARPA here, what parish and municipal governments can do. You saw a lot of these through Jackson's presentation as well. So certainly supporting public health expenditures, responding to direct and indirect effects of the pandemic, addressing the pandemic's negative economic impacts. And this could include by providing assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, and affected industries, offsetting the government's own revenue shortfalls through 2023 to pay for government public services and projects. A lot of flexibility, certainly within that one, considering the variety of services provided by the government. But to note here that revenue shortfall, there is within ARPA a methodology that the federal government is actually using to measure what the government's true revenue shortfall is. And not all municipalities and parishes experienced the revenue shortfall that New Orleans did. There are some that maybe perhaps that had small downturns and others really not at all. So they would not be eligible to use the funding under that particular purpose if there was no revenue shortfall. Providing premium pay for essential workers, again, as Jackson had mentioned, and also investing in water, sewer, stormwater management, and broadband infrastructure. In terms of other infrastructure for local governments, it could be eligible as long as it does not surpass the loss under the revenue shortfall, and it could not be used for bonded projects. If we're paying bond debt, it would have to be sort of a pay-as-you-go infrastructure project. And as you see here, paying debt, including bond debt, reducing pension liability, replenishing reserve funds or rainy day funds, and paying legal settlements. Those are the no's, the clear that the federal funding relief cannot be used for those. Time frame, again, you saw this before, just to reiterate. So the first half of the funding, $194 million in the case of New Orleans, is here. The plan is that the second half of the allocation would be delivered in late spring of 2022. And again, the allocation must be committed to projects by the end of 2024. Okay, then we know how we're going to use it. And finally, all of it must be expended by 2026. So certainly several years to use the federal relief. And next, just to put $388 million into a little perspective here, that is about 59% of the city's pre-pandemic recurring general fund revenue, about 4 times the city's projected 2021 general fund revenue loss based on the most recent July revenue estimating conference. But to note, that is just 2021. The revenue may take additional years to fully recover, depending on what we see with the recovery from the pandemic. So that will have an impact. And finally, $388 million is about $996 per New Orleans resident. So onto BGR's guidance. We based a lot of our guidance looking at recent research that we had done, priorly done back a lot in 2019. And this research identified steps the city could take to direct more revenue to high priority needs. These steps including long-term planning, systematic analysis of funding sources and expenditures, and citizen participation and public accountability. So we realized even though this federal relief is one-time funding, there was definite applicability in some of these steps that we had previously identified for the city's other revenue sources. But to be clear, I just want to make sure our guidance focuses really on the processes for establishing priorities and making effective spending decisions and ensuring public oversight. We, BGR, in this report, we have not established this should be what we're spending the money on. These are the priorities. This is actually where the money needs to go. We're focused on the processes for getting there. So comprehensive planning being one of the main focuses and important parts of this. And in order to maximize the impact of this ARPA allocation, the city should develop a spending plan, but not just any spending plan here. One that first covers multiple years and includes options aligned with various economic recovery and funding scenarios. Again, the money does not have to be spent today, and we do not know what will happen tomorrow, either with the pandemic and the economic recovery, or with perhaps other funding that may come through a federal infrastructure bill, earmarks that are coming back. So important here to kind of have different tracks almost that could then, you could focus on the one that comes to actually align with what the reality is. The plan should establish spending priorities based on an analysis of underfunded needs that is informed by community input. It should maintain efficiencies that the city's achieved during the pandemic-related fiscal crisis. The city had to make cuts because of the downturn in revenue. Some of these they need to identify, and they've said that there have been efficiencies that have been realized. So seeing where you can do things actually with less money that did not have a negative impact on services, keep those going, and always be on the lookout for new efficiencies that would also allow you to redirect existing revenue. Also, the plan should prioritize expenditures that evidence suggests will deliver effective outcomes. This is really important. You don't just want to spend the money, but do something that works, where this is actually going to address the priority effectively. And looking at how some of the ways to determine that, you might be looking at strategic plans that have already been done to see where there's evidence that something would really get you to that outcome. All the data you have, evaluations that you've already done or in the process of doing, certainly, as well as national research on, if you're looking at a particular program, national research where others have done this to see what outcomes have been and establish best practices. And finally, again, the needs here are great. $388 million is not going to cover every single need. So there's certainly importance here of analyzing the cost effectiveness of spending options and looking at those that are really able to get the most done for the amount of money. So to drill down a little bit into establishing spending priorities, this is going to require a systematic analysis. First, certainly examining the evidence that the current funding is not sufficient to achieve an acceptable service level or an outcome. And then determining is there another funding source that could fill this gap, perhaps from efficiencies that have been realized, so you can redirect some funding, or with ARPA is actually a $1.9 trillion total package that includes various funding grants and opportunities that may be able to specifically address certain needs. These are outside of the city's own direct allocation. The systematic analysis should also determine if there is a dependable funding source after the federal relief is gone. So if you're looking at a program or something that is going to be ongoing, that is going to be long-term, you want to make sure that even if the federal relief is gone, there is still dependable funding to keep that going. The analysis, very importantly, should assess the impact or consequences of not funding this. What is it? What are the effects going to be? How do we quantify those? What are the impacts they're going to be? And sort of vice versa, I guess, what are the benefits of if we do increase the funding, if we do this, what can we expect to see? And then finally, aligning those, looking at how those impacts align with community concerns. So just briefly, some local planning examples. Now these, we don't know if they, at this point, this is early, do they have every component and element that I've gone through in the previous slides of the planning process? We don't know. This is sort of a framework that we know that two neighboring parishes, St. Tammany and Jefferson, are looking at. St. Tammany is in the process of developing an ARPA strategic investment framework, they're calling it. They are having focus groups with stakeholders and residents to inform the framework, and their parish economic development agency is helping to develop the framework. In Jefferson Parish, the parish council has established an ARPA task force. The task force will present its findings and recommendations for using ARPA funds to the council in 6 months. And the task force will be holding meetings throughout these 6 months that will be public meetings that will allow the public to follow along and see the course that they're taking. And to add here, New Orleans does have a stimulus command task force. That the difference here, a main difference between what Jefferson has, New Orleans task force is really looking at some of those other funding programs through ARPA, through the federal relief, not specifically the city's allocation, but how nonprofits, industries, other entities within the city can connect and tap into that funding so more funding actually comes in to our community. Oversight and accountability, always important, and here certainly to make sure that the ARPA funding, the relief, achieves its desired results. So a couple roles here for different entities. For the city administration, they should provide residents with a multi-year spending plan and regular updates. Such a plan would give residents the big picture. It can be difficult, even though we have an open meeting process sometimes, to go through and search when are they going to be discussing ARPA funding, how much. So giving the big picture would certainly be part of policymakers' responsibility to inform citizens. They're making decisions on behalf of these citizens. The city administration should also maintain a dashboard, an online dashboard that tracks ARPA expenditure and results. The dashboard could show sort of expenditures by category, how that compares perhaps with what was initially planned or what is remaining, as well as linking to contracts or cooperative endeavor agreements if there are other entities that are going to be carrying out some of the ARPA expenditures and results. What you see as in progress from these expenditures, be it progress reports, evaluations, interim evaluations, those sorts of things that can really help residents follow along and see what's happening. The city council also has an important role here, and some suggestions for oversight and accountability for them would be creating a special fund for the ARPA dollars to facilitate auditing and transparency, to alert the public to proposed expenditures through an online calendar when the administration is proposing an expenditure to the council. This would let people know so they could, again, hopefully they have the big picture through a plan, but follow along further. And then when these requests are made, again, when the administration is coming to the council for an expenditure request, make sure the council is requiring sufficient detail and explanation. How do we know what's backing why this is necessary for this particular expenditure? What can we expect? What are the outcomes that we're really looking for with this? And finally, it could also maintain a dashboard that tracks its appropriations for ARPA. And then finally, the Inspector General here in New Orleans, we have an Inspector General whose mission closely aligns with this type of thing. He's an independent, the Inspector General is an independent watchdog, as I said, with a dedicated source of funding and the expertise really to monitor, audit, and evaluate ARPA spending. So some final thoughts here, really just want to emphasize the opportunity here and to seize the opportunity. We heard a lot after Katrina, don't just build back better. And there's really applicability here, thinking about the city's allocation of resources, not just going back to where we were before, but looking forward and doing it even better. And we know certainly the pre-pandemic allocation might not reflect the emerging concerns that either resulted from or were highlighted by this public health emergency. Just to note, even before the pandemic, BGR had urged the city to take a more comprehensive and systematic approach to identifying areas where it could redirect revenues to its many high priority, yet continually underfunded needs. So hopefully, again, we're not just building back and going with a resource allocation to the way it was before, but we're through this process going to make improvements, and we are going to come back better than ever. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Susie, thank you so much for that thorough presentation. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, the CAO of the City of New Orleans, Mr. Gilbert Montaño. He serves as the Chief Administrative Officer and was appointed to be Mayor Cantrell's second in command when she took office in 2018. Gilbert oversees the day-to-day management of the city's numerous departments and agencies, preparing and executing the city's budget, coordinating and leading the city's innovation team. Prior to moving to New Orleans, Mr. Montaño worked in senior leadership in Mayor Richard Berry's administration at the city of Albuquerque. This is a city which won awards for government transparency, especially around budget information and spending. We're delighted to have Gilbert here to present the city's current plan and priorities for the American Rescue Plan dollars and what opportunities there are for residents and advocates to engage. Mr. Montaño, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, but we're not seeing your slides.
Okay, I think they are putting my slides up
Great.
currently. Well, I can go ahead and get started as they're, you guys good?
Yes, 1 second.
Okay, maybe 1 second. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the time here to spend with you all. I have a rather thorough presentation similar to my council presentation prior and earlier this week, but would be happy to engage in, of course, the post questions thereafter. One of the things that I want to just highlight from a macro perspective is I appreciate the perspective certainly of the other speakers and certainly want to get into more of the application piece. So often, there is a academic and a perfect scenario that one could identify as things to do and how to do it, but then there's actually a practical application that separates from the academic perspective. And I hope that we're able to bifurcate the differences between the two, which has often been a rub. It's easy to identify and manage and articulate things from the outside. Sometimes when you're on the inside, on the ground, the actuality and the perspective is obviously very different. So we have spent the last 3 years diligently working to try to stabilize and strengthen the fiscal position of our city. As you know, COVID-19 caused unprecedented fiscal challenges. However, we feel that we were able to quickly work through our public health crisis and create and develop prudent fiscal measures. And now we are traveling down what we feel is the road to recovery. The goal is obviously to stabilize the city's budget following the revenue loss and the fiscal challenges that were created by the pandemic, and focusing on short-term liquidity and long-term planning. As we look to the future of the plan, we are excited that it is our vital lifeline for our community and will help the city restore funding cut during the pandemic to resume normal operation. While we were thankful, we were recently able to hold our revenue estimating conference, which is of course the basis of your budget, and recognize new revenue, which is the ARP funds. It was important in that revenue estimating conference that the city is projected not to fully recover to our revenues for at least 4 to 5 years. The ARP funds being discussed today will be absolutely critical in filling those revenue gaps and developing long-term sustainable budget for the city for years to come. And one of the things that I think is most important, and I know the number of $387.5 million is being thrown around. That is what Congress has identified for the city of New Orleans, but good, prudent fiscal management only identifies and spends what we have. Right now, that is $194 million. So frankly, from a budgetary perspective, I'm not even planning or identifying that money in hand until we actually receive it. We had a pretty rough first experience with stimulus funds. About $50 million was carved off from the state and put into a different fund that was designed for residents of New Orleans. So we have some definite reticence about any kind of identification of funds we don't currently have. So that second half of the allocation is not guaranteed, and until we actually have it in hand, we're managing the budget based on the cash we have, which is $194 million. And I've tried to be extremely vocal on this is not new windfall dollars. This is not money that we have now just been able to spend on new things, but it's actually identified. If you looked at the REC numbers and our significant revenue loss, we're actually using these from a backward perspective where we're going to fill the gaps of revenue loss all the way back to 2025 and then working thereafter. We want to make sure that we maintain all protocols established by ARPA funds and all of the reporting requirements. Of course, we're in a unique position in that we have significant revenue loss. So our criteria for using our funds are a little bit more wide than other cities because of our significant hit as relates to the COVID pandemic. So as we mentioned, and we can go to slide 6 if you all are there. This is a important sensitivity analysis that we took to create and ensure accuracy to our revenue fixture, and showed our revenue forecast lagged pre-pandemic levels by over 500 million from 2020 to 25. As I mentioned, we want to work backward to use these ARP funds to fill those revenue gaps and move forward accordingly. But we understand that there are serious and vital needs, obviously, that our community has in the present. And we want to make sure that we use some of these fundings immediately to meet service gaps and help our residents recover pandemic. The next couple of slides, I think, are relatively telling as far as the use of revenue. This slide in particular demonstrates the continued gap between post-pandemic revenue and pre-pandemic revenue, including ARPA Tranche 1 funding, spread out to fill the revenue loss. ARPA Tranche 2 funding is not included as it is not guaranteed. And as you can see, if we use ARPA funding to bring the city spending back to pre-pandemic levels, we will have a funding gap as early as 2023. Obviously, this is not the path we intend to take, but I think visually it shows how much we are still progressing based on our revenue projections and what would happen if we were just to go back to the way we were using our ARPA funds, and why it's so important to realize this is not new money for new reoccurring expenses, and we're being very prudent in regards to how the use is being into play. The next slide is my expenditure gap. This slide demonstrates the gap between post-pandemic revenue and projected expenditures. This is a scenario is a little slightly better, but it delays the funding gap until 2024. This too is not a position we want the city to be in coming years. So managing the ARPA funding is what we have received. At the same time, setting expectations for city departments to continue be prudent and manage the expenditures and identify and operationalize those efficiencies as we continue down that road to recovery. Wanted to give a table that demonstrates how ARPA funding gives the illusion of a large surplus in 2021. However, this funding is not going to be fully continued to match the revenue shortfalls that we feel down the line. This to me is a huge warning light on how we're using our funds and the best way to manage the funds. That's a lot of red on the revenue gap, and ensuring that we have abilities to close those gaps is vital for the long-term sustainability, the liquidity, and the overall progression of the city of New Orleans. The next graph is an important one because this removes the one-time revenue and just looks at the reoccurring revenue, which is also cause for concern. Of course, when you're dealing and managing with a budget, your reoccurring revenue is your most important. Your one-time funds are should never be budgeted or managed for reoccurring expenses. And if you were to take out the money from the one-time perspective, you will see that large delta thereafter, and showing where the recovery actually plays closer to 2025. Now, economists and others have debate on that 2025 number. We are being conservative with it, but I think with the onset of the Delta variant and other pieces happening right now, I feel confident that we are being closer to accuracy than opposed to some of the more progressive identifiers that would lead some to believe faster recovery. And if it is faster recovery, that's only better news for us. The next two slides show two key tables from the city's recent REC. This table highlights the impact to general fund through 2025 without additional identified revenue sources. And this next table demonstrates the impact to our fund balance through 2025 without additional identified revenue sources as well. These are all guiding tools to how we're building our budget, and spreadsheets that we look at on a day-to-day basis to ensure and projections that our city is aligned for the long-term fiscal health of the organization. The budget process. This is the operating timeline that we are under. You can see that where we are now, we're in the middle of the kickoff for our overall department's training. We had the revenue estimating conference last week. I was on the phone with all three rating agencies. It was a vital and important piece of our organization, maintaining a strong bond rating so that our investors will invest as we go out to the market. We have a strong story to tell, and I was proud to represent the city along with our team on those rating agency calls through Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. We should have early rating decisions, I think, later this month. And then you'll see how that plays into how we are planning to provide the rest of the budget process. But that bond rating issue is a big piece of it. It's the equivalent of your credit score as an individual. It allows how much you want to have. This kind of just walks through a little bit more of that process. Wanted to talk a little bit about public engagement. Both the mid-year adjustment ordinance and the proposals for the 2020 budget will be presented publicly at the city council meetings where residents may provide comments. I will say that monthly there is a budget hearing as well, where we have monthly updates for our personnel and other operating spending, so that there's a good grasp on exactly where we are year to year, month to month, especially as we move into this next process of budgeting to actuals as opposed to carryover budgets, part of the zero-based budgeting process that we've identified very early in the process. Now, certainly the Mayor's Neighborhood Engagement Office is the city's permanent mechanism for public participation in government decision-making. The neighborhood organization groups creates opportunities for dialogue, information sharing, partnership, and action between city government and neighborhood residents and leaders. Some of the conversations that have been present, and I know that have been addressed, is how are you going to spend the money? Now, certainly that I did say that it is a revenue loss tool that we're going to go from the back forward, but that also leaves an opportunity for us to address very germane and vital needs for the city of New Orleans. And so we are going to submit a mid-year budget plan. If you looked at our last budget, there was a lot of deficits because we have allowed departments to overspend until we were able to do this budget ordinance. But we're going to start with about $70 million of our ARPA funds, essentially, to be able to restore and initiate some new projects, generally focused around public safety. We'll have more than one phase in this regard, but until we are more secure both on the revenue growth and the future of this, most of these expenditures are related to either one-time funding or vital public safety needs. The broad categories focused by the Control Administration will remain crime and public safety, restoring government operations, and improving quality of life. We're being very thoughtful, as I said, and I think the next 4 slides give a little bit more of detail of how these dollars will be proposed to the City Council and utilized. Funds will be used, obviously, to return some agencies to full operation, specifically our public safety agencies, to address crime and other issues as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. NOP retention and promotion, this is a big piece for our organization. It's a countrywide issue where officers are not signing up to be policemen anymore or policewomen anymore. We have a decline in our recruitment. It's a national issue, and our retirees are leaving faster than we're able to replace them. So in order to focus on the officers we have, this is a retention opportunity to give trajectory for about 160 senior police officers to keep them on the force. Our New Orleans Fire Department also should be remained back to full staffing and continuing to have recruitments and allow the opportunity to exercise both mandatory and unscheduled overtime. New Orleans EMS, of course, is an important piece of our, what we call our public safety trinity, our NOPD, NOFD, and New Orleans EMS. This allows a little bit more in staffing enhancement. We always like to have about anywhere from 20 to 25 ambulances on the street. This will allow overtime to provide that. We also are increasing what is a structural deficit for a longstanding OPSO agency. We had to increase, and as good investment, some mental health services for our inmates, but also continue and drive the recruitment pieces for the organization. We wanted to shore up some SPCA operations to ensure that our animals have the proper care and nurture. And we are planning on addressing some LPRs for the New Orleans East area so that we could use force multipliers to the best of our ability in regards to our public safety initiatives. Altogether, those address that portion of public safety. Now, as I started to state in the beginning of the presentation, well, the beginning of the last slide, I should say, that because there is a disconnect between the amount of recruits as we have with the amount of those leaving, we need to create with some sort of augmentation to police agencies. And once again, this is another national practice that is occurring as every city's challenged with this same issue. How do you augment your police force and better identify what types of calls should a badge and a gun attend to, as opposed to more of a mental health issue or crisis? So part of the new initiatives is to develop an alternative response program through our health department and better triage those calls through 911 so that officers go where officers need to be. And then if it's a mental health care worker or some other wraparound service necessary, we have the opportunity to address that in that regard. The restorative justice program, this is an important piece to fund over a 3-year period, a diversion program of about 560 cases. This is all part of the overall opportunities that we feel are important to address some of the crime holistically for those that have had a challenged life in some cases. The next piece of it is the municipal court mental health program. This is contracting with the public defender's office to provide mental health services for individuals who are continuously repeating through the court system due to mental illness. The next major pieces are restoring government operations. The organization, the city, was able to end furloughs for city employees. Public safety, we started in the beginning of the year, and all employees were returned back to normal operations, I believe maybe 2 or 3 months ago. And then, of course, we're allowed to provide them that pay that they went without, similar to the federal government when they furloughed their employees for 2020 and 21. Vitally important is our vehicle and replacement plan and strategy. This is what gives me significant pause and concern. We have a by far one of the most ill-equipped vehicle and equipment shortage as far as the city that I've been part of. It's a long-term systemic issue, trying to rebuild and reorganize, how we develop our fleet program and the like. We have tried on many occasions, and I'm really trying to build that into this piece here. It's important to note, about 70% of our employees are not in a building. They're in some sort of vehicle, whether it's a lawnmower, a fire truck, or a police car. So understanding that, that significant fraction of our employees out there in the community, in the city on something with tires is an important piece for us to maintain a replacement strategy. Want to focus on some revenue agencies, specifically the construction agency, and having to move plans and permits along, ensuring that those pieces of our external services are able to come back up to full staffing so that we can move along some of these major priority projects moving forward. Go to the next slide. And then as far as the quality of life, there is significant money to ensure Clean Up NOLA campaign continues to proceed, focused on illegal dumping, some looking into evaluating some transfer stations and potential convenience centers where there is opportunities to dump, but just overall cleaning the city, which has obviously been a major priority that has been from day one, but trying to add some resources according to that. Want to focus some dollars on our early childhood education funding. And of course, we had spent the last 2 years foregoing our judgment list, which is a multi-year judgment list against the city that had been kind of moved along, and trying to address it per council ordinance has been something that we had to forego for the last 2 years, but we're trying to reconcile that at this point. We can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, there's a lot of variables to consider. The impacts of Delta and the Delta variant, some of those earlier slides that I shared with the group showed a projection, a revenue projection. And although it's conservative, that can turn very quickly depending on an opening and a shutdown. And remember, from an economic perspective, economies can shut down very fast, as we saw in this regard, but opening them up again and starting them again is a very slow process. So despite how fast it can shut down, to actually restart that engine again, I mean, like I said, New Orleans is seeing multi-years before we see it go back to pace. So that's a very major cause of concern for the organization, is the Delta variant. There's two pieces of some policy decisions on living wage. Like I said, we're supportive of, but it has a fiscal and financial impact that we're better trying to determine. And the changes of future ARPA funding, that second half that we do not have yet. So maintaining the idea that we only have half of the 387 has been vital. And then of course, we had one of the most active hurricane seasons last year, and we're just preparing should that occur again. And I think that should conclude, if I'm not mistaken, the overall presentation. The only thing in conclusion that I would say is that the process for ARP funding has to be one of leveled expectation and not misinformation about it being new or projected revenue of some sort. Because if you look at our overall projections and our revenue losses over the last few years, and then the projection out to where we are actually set to recover, that money needs and must be spent to structurally balance our budgets until we ultimately have a recurring revenue stream to provide for that. We have to maintain a significantly strong reserve or fund balance so that should those emergencies come up to par, we have dollars ready and resources available. And ultimately, those $100 million in cuts that we made last year, having to go back to a normal budget process or a normal budget from an agency perspective is just not an option. There's a lot of optimization that different agencies and efficiencies were able to occur, a lot of new force multipliers, as I've mentioned, that we're trying to develop, but then also trending needs that we have to address both in the near and long term. So with that, I'll conclude, turn it back over, I guess, to Nellie for the next stages of, assuming question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilbert, and to all of our presenters. Truly, this is complicated. The situation that the city is in is complicated. The situation that the world is in is complicated. And we are all learning and responding to the best information available to us, which is not always all the information that we want, certainly, especially in a crisis and a prolonged crisis such as this. The rest of our presenters are going to come back on screen now for our question and answer. CBNO works to bring people together across diverse perspectives and sectors of our community. I'm really excited to have this full panel here representing a lot of different research and backgrounds and positioning relative to this spending. To have a discussion here. We've had an active Q&A. Please continue to add your questions to the question and answer box. I'm inviting Kelsey Foster, our moderator, back here. Again, Kelsey is a board member and advocacy committee chair for the Committee for a Better New Orleans. We've been working on budget issues for quite some time, and in particular, making sure that people have the context and information that they need to plug into the budget process, as well as pushing for a more participatory process of allocating the budget. Kelsey is absolutely the expert we need here to help get these questions across to our esteemed panelists. I will hand it off and go away.
Thanks, Nellie, and thank you, everyone. This has been very, very informative. I really appreciate all of your presentations, and for all of our participants, thank you guys. Very, very good questions in the Q&A. I am going to do my level best to get to them. I promise. So first up, and something that I think we see pop up in Q&A in a couple places, is what, short of the city's kind of timeline for the budget process itself, what kind of proactive measures is the city of New Orleans taking for residents to have some sort of voice in the ARPA funding conversation? So understanding, right, that this is a very complicated situation. This isn't kind of a place where we can find ways to allocate money to each of our personal interests or pet projects. What is really going to be the process for folks in the community to be involved, or what is an appropriate way for folks to get involved?
Well, Kelsey, I'd ask you to, based on my presentation, the premise of the question, I guess I would ask you to elaborate on when I tried to articulate this is not new money, right? So the process of involvement is restoration in many pieces. So maybe you could better elaborate based on what I've articulated, the premise of that question.
Sure. So I guess knowing that we are in a place where our community has a lot of needs immediately, and kind of you shared from the Brookings Institute that we're trying to balance immediate need with long-term need, right? So this isn't new money. We have to kind of be able to we're trying to do it all, right? As far as kind of meeting immediate need, what is the best way for kind of the people facing those needs, whether that's folks looking down the barrel of eviction or getting laid off maybe for the second or third time? What is a way for us to kind of make some space for the immediate need?
Well, I think I said, over the course of the last year, we have monthly budget meetings that are not attended, frankly. I don't see many participation. Those are often a good way to connect. And those have been ongoing every year since we've been here on a monthly basis, that public engagement process. Certainly there is various different connectors out there. Mayor controls very much in the community all the time. Those type of pipelines are obviously available. I'm still not completely reconciling exactly, I think, what kind of forum you're talking about. The forums that have and are currently existed are designed for public participation, whether it be through the council or through our budget hearing process or through the collective budgetary process in general, the town halls and the like. So absent of the, dozens of different venues already established and many not attended, frankly, what others are you, what am I missing, I guess? So outside of the multi-dozens that occur that are not attended or provided by which others?
Sure. To our other panelists, is there anything you all have seen in other jurisdictions that you'd like to maybe throw out, or any thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's been a number of approaches that have been taken by different states and cities. In the city of Shreveport, for example, we've seen numerous town halls that were held throughout the month of June, visiting different neighborhoods, approaching different communities to try to get their input on how the city council and the mayor's office there can kind of guide funding to areas of need, and also to collect proposals. I think obviously Gilbert has emphasized that the city of New Orleans is expecting to have these revenue shortfalls over the next few years, and that's what they're prioritizing with this first tranche of money in particular. But I think that there is a compelling interest to kind of try to include as many people in this process as possible. Because even if this isn't new money, it is still public money. And so the public should have some level of input. Another example I think that's important another city that has experienced a lot of financial hardship lately and faces a lot of similar problems to New Orleans is Detroit, which actually did door-to-door canvassing and surveys to kind of collect input from the public to kind of help guide how ARPA funds would be spent in Detroit, in the city of Detroit, and in Wayne County. And so I would suggest that there's opportunities to go beyond the normal budget process that a lot of cities are availing themselves of to collect input and kind of guide more democratically how these funds will be spent.
I just wanted to pop in here and add, I have the pleasure of working with the mayor's team on a project right now looking at government participation and resident trust in particular. And I see government, like trust in the government is really gained and lost in crisis, in moments of crisis. People, and part of the reason we're having this webinar in the first place is that we're hearing a lot of concern about what's happening in this process, and people aren't really feeling like they've been involved from what I'm hearing. So I think the bold act of going out to where residents are and actively and proactively seeking advice and involvement and explaining the difficulty that the city has with these trade-offs between our long-term needs and our immediate needs would go a long way to support resident trust.
Thanks, Nellie. Great. And I think that Jackson, you gave us some really good examples as well. And again, I will reiterate, if you are part of a community group who's really interested in this kind of information, we're really here to help you get, answers to questions or find meeting dates or meeting agendas. We really want to help you to be as engaged of a citizen as you can be. I want to move us along a little bit, and I see we have a couple of questions specifically about, it was mentioned that within the infrastructure spending of ARPA, there are a focus on kind of addressing inequities. Could we get are there any examples either from other jurisdictions or from the city of New Orleans on when we're kind of thinking about infrastructure and inequity? And I know we've had a lot of infrastructure talk in our country lately when it comes to public funding. I think it'd be really interesting to hear some examples of what that could mean for New Orleans. Anybody have any thoughts on addressing inequity through infrastructure?
I think one example, when you look at what the federal guidance is with this, it's more open in terms of certain types of infrastructure, in terms of broadband, in terms of sewer, water, and stormwater. Outside of that, examples they give, you're more limited. You can do some pay-as-you-go infrastructure in terms of up to the amount of revenue loss a city has. But an example could be if you're also looking at infrastructure, and I'm not saying necessarily that this applies with New Orleans, but just to give a basic example of what you would be looking at would be something, for example, like building a health clinic in an underserved area or something like that. So there's an infrastructure, a building, it's not sewer, it's not water, but that is something that would address, in a certain area that could address a particular inequity, putting that building, that health clinic in a particular area or something like that. So those are along the lines, that would be a concrete for an infrastructure example of something that would fit into that.
Yeah, I would just add to that. And Susie, I think that's a really good example. Maricopa County actually in Arizona has invested in opening 2 health centers that are dedicated to COVID response throughout the county. And they've placed those in particular neighborhoods that have been harder hit by COVID and also are behind in vaccination rates. So that's one way to kind of go about that. I think other infrastructure, obviously, things like drainage come to mind here in Louisiana. And I think that's probably top of mind for a lot of people. I think that's a worthwhile investment, especially in neighborhoods that are disproportionately feeling the effects of climate change and rising sea levels and flooding. I also think there's also consideration of something I've been thinking about a lot lately. The city of Austin is dedicating a considerable amount of its funding towards providing more affordable housing. And that is an allowable use of ARPA funds as well. And so I would suggest that looking into opportunities to invest in ensuring that people can be housed, including utilizing these other funds, right? So we also have the rental assistance and the home funds, and the state actually also has a substantial money coordinating those resources with these local dollars, local ARPA dollars, I think will be important in this infrastructure picture.
Thank you. On a very similar line, I think thinking about equity, we've got a couple follow-up questions on the minimum wage or living wage ordinance at the city. That's a really great question, and I'm so glad that came up in today's conversation. I don't want to steal anybody's answer, but I do want to, before we jump into it, be super clear about a term called local control. And this is something that every institution on this call today has been working on and thinking about a lot. The city of New Orleans cannot actually change its living wage, right? We can change the minimum wage for city employees and contractors. We cannot mandate that every employer in the parish pay a certain wage. That is actually going to be controlled by our state legislature, who has been pretty clear that they won't support raising the local minimum wage here in Orleans Parish or the city of New Orleans. So I just want to be super clear about that. That's a issue of local control that has been frustrating a lot of us for a really long time when local decisions are controlled at a state level, right? However, we do have a couple of questions here. One, I guess, kind of how are we thinking? Gilbert, I believe you mentioned that the city is thinking about kind of supplementing the living wage ordinance with some of the ARPA funding. And then we also have a question here, maybe outside of anyone here's expertise, but I'm happy to speak to it as well, about if there is any push to kind of encourage retiring business owners to move towards ESOP plans or employee and stock plans or cooperatives. So with that, I will open it up to anybody who'd like to add a little more on living wage plans.
Well, I can speak from the city perspective. So living wage, I think we've said we were supportive of the initiative and the policy. Frankly, it only affects a very small portion of City of New Orleans employees. I want to say less than 600 out of the 4,000+ that we have. And that's an easy fix, right, to raise them up. But the issue that the city runs into is what's called compression. So if you raise a certain employee's salary by 30%, going from $8, $9 to 15 and the like, then their supervisor now makes less than them in some cases, or just slightly above them. So then a domino effect happens. So it's not just about raising the 600 employees to living wage, which would be a very easy thing to do, but it's about the thousands of employees that affects thereafter. Our fire department is a very important example. So that turns what would cost $100,000 into $15-16 million. So that's why we have to really be very judicious in how we are doing those particular scalpel treatments relative to the living wage. That's what we are evaluating now, because it's not a small number. It's a very significant number. A vast majority of city employees will have a significant raise as a result of this. And that's not anything that's a bad policy decision. I think that they should, in many regards, do that, and we're supportive of it. It's just a matter of whether or not the city can afford that and the timing of when that would all take place. The second piece deals with our contractors. We can require our contractors to have them their employees pay a living wage. But once again, as we've bidded out contract, that was not part of the specs for the contract. Now, where if you had, and this is hypothetical, a $10 million project contract, and now you're having something similar to like a Davis-Bacon type living wage requirement, your bids are going to be coming out very different than what you earlier projected, because you now have cost control over the wage portion of it. So your contracts go up. So it's hitting from both sides, your side of specifically related to your contracts, but also your employees. So those are two very complicated pieces for an overall city budget, because the amount of dollars that it will require for us to increase as a result of those living wages. So that kind of addresses where we have the essentially analysis occurring. I think I'm set to present on a little bit more of this to the council later this month, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll have more of a thorough explanation and plan and path forward. But overall, I do plan to see something within our 2022 budget to address at least some phase or some portion of this. It's just all about, where those are reoccurring resources, and they're big. So I want to make sure that the city's set up for the long-term health and future as well.
Jackson or Susie, anything you'd like to add on living wage?
Susie, if you want to go first, I know I've talked a lot.
You're muted, Susie.
I think it'll be interesting. Certainly the city is looking at, sounds like, looking at that analysis that I don't have anything. I think we'll have to see and understand. There's a nice explanation from Mr. Montaño to really understand what comes out of that. I don't have anything additional to add.
Yeah, the only thing that I think I would add just really quickly from the state and local perspective is that these dollars can be used to supplement eligible workers, or what we've been calling frontline workers, in addition to like state and local workers, right? So you can actually provide up to $13 an hour or up to $25,000 overall per eligible worker using ARPA funds. That's obviously, that's limited by how you're spending all the money in the bigger picture, right? Which is, I think, a lot of what Gilbert has stressed is New Orleans has a lot of needs that they have to figure out how to spend these ARPA dollars on. But I think it is important for people to know that one of those uses, if cities and states choose to, could be to supplement those frontline workers who continue to be most at risk of contracting and being affected by COVID, and who also tend to be disproportionately people of color and women, especially here in Louisiana. So it is a important equity policy tool, I think, and something that I hope the city will consider. And the state more so, because the state has more money to work with than the city, to be honest.
Thanks everyone. I know we're getting down to our last minutes, so I want to ask one quick question. I know we've already kind of talked a little bit about infrastructure, but we do have a couple questions that deal specifically with flooding and sewage and water board, and any plans to invest ARPA funding on kind of water facing infrastructure.
I'm sorry, I missed the question, Kelsey. Could you repeat it?
Sure. We do have a couple of questions that are specifically about any plans to address flooding, sewage and water board investment, kind of the water facing side of infrastructure with ARPA funds.
Sure. So I don't want to get too, so sometimes this is the challenge that I have from a technical perspective, is differentiating the color of the various monies that we have, whether it's capital dollars, whether it's operational dollars, whether it's one-time dollars, whether it's federal dollars. As we've said many times, it gets complex. So as far as our main focus on flooding, which is a high priority, in the reorganization, rebuilding of the sewage and water board has been tantamount in that process. What I mentioned earlier in the presentation and what I did last week addressing those rating agency calls was to ensure that the city had strong credit to be able to go out to the market to sell our bonds, essentially. So we plan to sell our bonds later this month. I'm hoping about $364 million out of a total $500 million project. A large majority of that is designed for infrastructure, specifically to subsurface and above surface work relative to flooding and mitigation. You saw an announcement prior maybe 2 months ago, where we're going to invest in a significant power supply generation process to allow for those turbine 6 to not have the same reliance on that old power that we have, a new generation of power, so that we have long-term sustainability. So when we flood, not if, when we flood, we'll have significant more power and consistent redundancy as it relates to that. So overall, the investment in this particular piece speaks to the multi-millions of dollars, whether it's through capital or in some cases operational. You typically want to use your capital dollars for these type of investments that have longer than a 10-year life. Your operational dollars are typically for your day-to-day operations, and it's not the highest and best use, frankly, of your operational dollars. So you try to build up your capital reserves to ensure that those are better aligned and addressed with those issues. So I hope that gives some semblance of our dedication and investment. And of course, the capital plan and the capital budget is a community developed process that's gone through the budget process, the council process, and there's line items specifically on how and where those dollars are going to be allocated, and even a more detailed granular list as we get to the actual bond allocation once we sell those bonds. I just want to, I saw something in the chat that I wanted to highlight, because I know that I get this question often, and it deals with rental assistance. So if it's okay, let me just touch on that, because I know it is a big topic. The city's had about 15,000 applications for rental assistance. As of Monday, we've allocated $13 million. The delta between the need and the amount of money that we have is this big. So although we're not able to provide everybody their request, we have already expended our amount, $13 million currently, and we are asking the states and the state actually of Louisiana and others for additional funding to address some of those rental needs, because it is a major priority as eviction warnings and the like are coming out. So just wanted to highlight that, because I did see that in the question, that as of Monday, we have expended about $13 million, but we've had 15,000 applications. And no matter how much money I think we would receive, the number would keep growing as far as being able to provide everyone resources. So with that, I will defer back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. That is a very timely and very important point. So I thank you for jumping on that in our last minutes here. I apologize that we could not get to all of your questions. I thank y'all for asking very good questions. I realize this is very dense, very wonky stuff, and I really appreciate all of y'all tuning in today to engage and to learn. This takes energy, and I applaud all of you for being here. So with that, I will turn it back to Nellie to close us out.
Thank you all so much for joining us, especially to our presenters, Gilbert Montaño, Jackson Voss, Susie Dudis, and Kelsey Foster. Truly, this is complicated, and there are a lot of different perspectives that are really important. I was so inspired by the conversation here today, as well as by all of y'all's willingness to come to the table and discuss this together. CBNO believes and actively works towards building a better New Orleans together, and certainly we need all players at the table in order to do that. Just a quick note, Kelsey alluded to throughout that we are absolutely interested in continuing to follow up on this discussion with all of you who have participated today and beyond. You can learn more about our programming at our website, cbno.org. You can also sign up for our email newsletter there. You can follow us on social media. We are at Better NOLA everywhere. Follow us there to see action alerts, get explainers about city government and opportunities to make your voice heard. And you can also visit our website to support. We are a nonprofit organization. If you like what we do, there's a lot of ways to get involved and support, from volunteering on a one-off basis to joining our committees or board, to of course making a donation to help us build a better New Orleans. I'll follow up from today with the recording from our webinar and follow-up resources from our presenters, as well as upcoming opportunities to engage at the city level. As Gilbert mentioned, there is going to be an upcoming conversation with City Council next month, And we'd really love to see as many residents as possible engaged in that conversation. Thank you all so much for participating and have a wonderful day.